Welcome to the AT Parenting Survival Podcast, where you get help and guidance through the chaos of parenting a child with anxiety or OCD. This show is for educational purposes and is not intended to replace the guidance of a qualified professional. Here's your host, child therapist, Natasha Daniels.
Well, hello there, and welcome to another episode of the AT Parenting Survival Podcast. I hope everything's going well with you. I want to talk about, I think, probably one of the most important things that I try to convey to parents, which is why OCD can get worse with the wrong therapist. Because if you don't know that you're looking for a specific therapy or you're looking for a specific type of therapist, you're going to shop around and find the one that's the most convenient, the one that takes your insurance, that lives down the street, that will be easily accessible. And I want to talk about why the wrong therapist can actually create a bigger issue with OCD, and how to look for those red flags, and how to find a therapist that is qualified to treat your child's OCD. But before we get started, I want to let you know, ironically, that this podcast is sponsored by NoCD. NoCD offers affordable, effective, convenient therapy, and they are available in the U.S. and outside of the U.S. And you can schedule your free 15-minute consultation to see if NoCD is a right fit for you and your child. Just go to treatmyocd.com, treatmyocd.com. I'll leave a link in the show notes. And they always sponsor the episodes. They have no idea what I'm going to be talking about. And so this is coming from my heart. NoCD always sponsors my episodes, and I do appreciate that. But they are filling in the gap, and that is really important. And we're going to talk about why that gap is an issue, why it started, and what to do about it to get the right kind of help for your kids. I also have a free OCD webinar, 5 things that every parent raising a child with OCD should know. You can check that out for free. Just register at natashadaniels.com/OCD webinar. Okay, so let's talk about this. Why are most therapists not trained to treat OCD? Even though my OCD workbook, Crushing OCD for Kids, came out back in February of this year, I didn't do my press media tour. It's virtual, so it sounds bigger than it was. But my virtual tour was actually this past week, because I wanted to wait and do it for May Mental Health Awareness Month. I thought that would be a pretty cool thing to do, and have interviews with a lot of people who know nothing about OCD. I mean, so often we are in an echo chamber talking to the same people who are talking back and forth to each other about things that we all know about. And then we start to argue about little things and treatment approaches and, splitting hairs over words. It gets really stupid pretty fast. But I think we need to get out further and reach the people that really matter, the people that are in the dark about what OCD is, in the dark about proper OCD treatment. And so I was doing all these radio shows, and I was actually doing one today. So this episode is coming out way past when I'm recording this. This episode will be coming out May 28th, and I'm recording this at the beginning of May, just to give you some perspective on when I talk about things. This has happened at the beginning of the month, and you're hearing about it now. But I was interviewing I was being interviewed by a bunch of local radio channels, and some statewide channels, some countrywide. And I forget how much people don't know about OCD. And the questions indicated that. A lot of the times I was asked, why are therapists not trained to treat OCD? And there was just this big question mark of what? Why is that? So let's talk about it. Okay, so the scary thing is most therapists think that they can treat OCD. Let's start with that scary fact, because you only know what you know. And so if you think OCD is an anxiety disorder and OCD is just about control, and I talk about that with anxiety, I could talk about that with OCD, that's wrong. And it's wrong on so many levels. You really do need to seek out advanced training on OCD, what it is, how to assess it, how to diagnose it, and how to treat it, because it's not classified as an anxiety disorder anymore. In the DSM, it's actually got its own separate category, not under anxiety. It's two different parts of the brain. Anxiety is mainly centered around the amygdala, and OCD is mainly centered around the circuitry involving the basal ganglia, two very different disorders that often have a comorbid relationship, like so many other disorders, but they're treated differently. And so, yes, there's an overlap. Lots of people with OCD have an anxiety disorder as well, and a lot of people with anxiety have OCD, but they are still really different. So there is this misrepresentation of what OCD is, even in the mental health community. And I've seen that a lot. And so that's scary because you'll see a lot of therapists that say they treat OCD and ADHD and anxiety and attachment issues and depression and eating disorders and so on and more. But they have no real understanding of what OCD is and how it shows up and how the treatment is different. And so the therapist truly believes that they have the skills. And if a parent doesn't have their own knowledge and understanding of what OCD treatment looks like and what it does not look like, they're going to be blindly led as well. And the child can get worse because of it. It's like one of the only disorders I feel like where therapists can actually do more harm than good if they don't know what they're doing. And so my hope is to reach as many parents and even therapists as possible to get the therapist to realize, okay, I actually shouldn't be treating OCD. Maybe I just need to know enough to refer out, or I need to get some advanced training through the International OCD Foundation or another organization that has evidence-based training on OCD. Okay, so that is why there are not a lot of therapists out there. It's not taught typically in graduate school. Most graduate programs will touch on OCD incredibly briefly. They will talk about the DSM criteria of lots of different disorders, and they will not go into the treatment approach that is the most evidence-based for pediatric OCD. So that's scary. And hopefully it's changing. I think it's better than it used to be. I mean, I am hearing more graduate programs actually having like a track on OCD, but that's the rare exception to the norm, unfortunately. So let's start talking first about what are some evidence-based approaches for OCD. Well, thankfully, the OCD does have a really big research community. And so there is a lot of research in what are effective treatment approaches that are getting statistical results. And so I like that there has been a lot of research around these things. They're slow to evolve. And so, sometimes research has to catch up with what's going on. But currently, the go-to approaches for therapy around OCD center around three approaches. ERP, exposure response prevention, is a type of cognitive behavioral therapy that is really the go-to approach for childhood OCD. And so when somebody says, I do CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, that does not mean they do ERP, exposure response prevention. We'll talk about what it is in a minute. And so sometimes parents hear, okay, well, ERP is a type of CBT. Welcome to alphabet soup. And so when they see that somebody has on their website, I do CBT and I treat OCD, they assume, often erroneously, that must mean ERP. For me, if a therapist who specializes in treating OCD doesn't mention ERP, that's a red flag. Because I'm not going to put on my website, I use CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and not mention ERP if I'm an OCD therapist. And so that is one thing I look for, and we're going to talk about what to look for after the break. But I want to first go into what these approaches are, what they look like. So I'm going to just go over the three that I want to focus on today, and then we'll talk a little bit about what they are. Because if you can have an understanding of what these evidence-based approaches look like, then you're going to know what it doesn't look like, right? That makes sense. So a lot of people misunderstand ERP, exposure response prevention. They think it's really scary, and they're going to just expose your child to all these horrible things, and then they're going to just have to sit there with their anxiety and deal with it. It's actually a much more compassionate approach than that. One of the main issues with OCD is that you get this intrusive thought or feeling, and OCD kind of sells you the lie that if you could just do this certain thing, whether it's mental or physical, then you can get relief from your OCD. We call that a compulsion. And that's the loop that OCD gets you stuck in. I'm going to give you all these intrusive thoughts or feelings. They're horrible. You're tormented by them. And then I'm going to offer you the solution as OCD. I'm going to sell it to you and say, if you just do X, Y, and Z, these thoughts will not bother you as much, or you can fix this. And the more you do those compulsions, whether they're mental or physical or avoidance, the more intrusive thoughts you have, the bigger OCD grows. And so the idea is that you're going to disrupt that loop, that glitch in the brain that's happening where you get stuck in doing over and over again, expecting some relief that's not coming. Now, rationally, you get that. Most people with OCD get that this is not helping, but I can't stop because I feel compelled to do it over and over again to get that relief that I might get in the very brief short term, but I'm not getting in the long term. And so ERP purposely triggers the intrusive thought or feeling and then teaches the person to sit with that discomfort without scratching the itch that OCD so desperately wants you to scratch. And that will look different for each person. And it starts off very small in bite-sized pieces. You're doing small little tiny exposures and then not doing the compulsion. And I kind of look at it like the metaphorical OCD gym. Like I'm going to go lift weights and build up my muscles to tolerate discomfort so that when I am naturally getting an intrusive thought, I've practiced this and I know how to not respond to OCD in a way that it will grow it physiologically. I don't want those neural pathways to grow. And they grow when I get an intrusive thought and I ride that neural pathway all the way to the compulsion. OCD wants that. It's getting solidified in my brain. And so when I disrupt that pattern and that cycle, I'm disrupting the growth of OCD and I'm getting stronger. And so those thoughts don't hook me in as easily. They lose the power. And that's what ERP does, is it takes the power away from OCD and the OCD thoughts, and it makes the person feel stronger and able to resist them and sit with the discomfort the thoughts bring. It is so powerful. And I've seen so many kids in my practice, in my online communities, make such huge strides once they get a really effective exposure therapist who can do ERP in an effective way. I've also worked with a lot of parents who cannot find that unicorn of a therapist who works with kids and understands ERP, and they've had to learn it themselves. And I don't feel like there's anything wrong with that. If you can't access clinically sound support, then you can access other resources. And that is actually why I created my online courses at atparentingsurvivalschool.com. And it's actually why I just wrote an OCD workbook for kids that systematically go through every step I would if they were in my practice and walk kids through the understanding of what OCD is, what disguises OCD wears for them, because it's different for each kid, what exposures they can do, and how they can develop a lifestyle of crushing OCD. That's why I called it Crushing OCD Workbook for Kids, because I'm not creative. And that's what you're actually doing, is you're crushing it and you're making it livable and small. So that's ERP. And that is really the go-to first line treatment for OCD is ERP, especially for kids. But I think for everybody, ERP. If you haven't tried ERP yet, I wouldn't be moving on to other modalities. But there's two other modalities that work really well with kids as well. And that is ACT. And ACT stands for Acceptance Commitment Therapy. And ACT was not an OCD therapy, but it was adopted by the OCD community a while ago at this point. And more research is being done about the effectiveness of ACT as a supplement to ERP. And there's also people who are doing ACT-based ERP. Like they're superpowering it. They're coming together. And ACT, I'm not an ACT therapist, but I do appreciate ACT, and I feel like it has its place. I think a lot of ERP therapists already sprinkled in some ACT principles, but you can go to a therapist that isn't an ACT ERP therapist, and that's still good. And ACT is about looking, and I'm going to simplify this, so don't email me and say, Natasha, that wasn't a good definition of ACT. I'm just going to try to make it really simple. But with ACT, you're teaching kids how to have a relationship with those thoughts and look at their values. And so looking at, what do I care about? I really care about going to my friend's house and hanging out with her, but my OCD is telling me that her house is contaminated and I can't stay there. And it's disrupting what I care about. And so it's using those motivators and helping people get insight to what they care about and what their values are and how OCD gets in the way of that. And so it is a beautiful supplement to, I think, ERP therapy. I think they both have their place. And then when you could do value-based exposures, that's even better because you're really combining both of those methodologies. And that's what I would do in my practice. I don't have my private practice anymore because I closed it down after my husband died 3 years ago, but I do still provide support for parents online in my online communities at AT Parenting Community. And I do feel like when I was in my private practice, if, let's say, I had a child, this happened quite a few times. I had a child who, their remote control was contaminated according to OCD, and they really wanted to play their video games, and they couldn't because it was taking away the things they really cared about, whether it was the computer or their phone or the Xbox controller. And the parent might have wanted them to work on doing exposures around things that were impacting the family, like you need to get to school, or you need to do your laundry, or you need to not be in the bathroom for 500 hours and no one else can access it. So that sometimes the parents would have their goals or the things that were really noticeable as far as like where the dysfunction was happening. But the child was very motivated to work on being able to touch that game controller or being able to touch the computer, things that they cared about. And we would start with where they cared about it because that's where the string was. We want to find that string and we want to pull it. And I always talk about the string. Find that little piece of string so you can pull it. It's a thread. And you can get momentum if you find that thread. And so that was a value for them. I care about being able to play my video game, and I'm motivated to work on it because I want to touch that game controller. So that would be an example of like a kid value-based exposure. Parents may be like, that's not a value I really care about, but they care about it. And to move the dial and really speak to them is more important than what you care about, no offense. Because ultimately, it's their journey, and ultimately, they're the ones that are going to have traction or not traction. And so it's not about what will be best for the family unit. It's where do we start that will really get some traction. So ACT, acceptance commitment therapy, is a really great supplement to ERP. So if I was seeing an ACT therapist and they did exposures and it was ACT oriented, that's still very, very good. And if I have a child who is absolutely not ready to do ERP, the idea of any kind of exposure is overwhelming for them, then it might be great if they go and see an ACT therapist first to just learn about how do you have a relationship with your thoughts, with your intrusive thoughts, and not get hooked in. And so an ACT therapist can start there and then jump into exposures. And so it gives a little more wiggle room for where to go with that, where you might have an ERP therapist who says, if they're not willing to do exposures, I can't work with them. I was never like that as a therapist. I was always like, I'll work with you no matter where you're at. Like, I'll work with you. I'll work with your kid. I'll work with anybody who's willing to come into my office around OCD. Because if the child's willing to show up, but they're not ready for exposures, then there's so much we could still do. I could educate them about OCD. I could develop rapport with them. If they're not willing to come in, well, is the parent willing to come in? Because I'll work with you. And that leads me to the third and final treatment approach that I support for pediatric OCD, and that is SPACE. So SPACE stands for Supportive Parenting for Anxious Childhood Emotions. I'm not a fan of the acronym on so many levels, but it's a mouthful. But it was created by Ellie Leibovitz out of Yale. It has a ton of research to back it up. And really, it was a therapy that was created like in a lab for them to do randomized controlled clinical trials. And it's learning how to systematically pull back your accommodations to your child's anxiety or OCD. And so when we're talking about accommodations in the SPACE realm, we're talking about your involvement in growing the anxiety or OCD. So OCD is often a family affair, and you are often part of the compulsion. And so your child may not be able to touch something and they want you to touch it. Or your child might ask you for reassurance over and over and over again, and you're stuck on a loop. Am I a bad person if I said this? Am I a bad person if I did this? I touched my nose, then I touched my mouth. Is that bad? Am I going to get sick? My food has a dot in it. Is it okay to eat? Right? You're this metaphorical sink. You're completing the OCD loop. And so space teaches you how to pull back. And even with anxiety, space addresses that in a similar style of you pulling back those accommodations of, I'll talk for you. You sleep with me. I will, walk you here. I will, spoon feed you reassurance. It's really empowering the child and conveying the message of, you've got this. This is hard, but you've got this, versus I'm going to swoop in and do everything to help you avoid and fuel your anxiety. And so the space approach is really, really helpful, especially when we're talking about OCD, where you don't even realize you're part of the compulsion. And it's hard to know, where do I start? Like, once parents learn, oh my gosh, I'm the metaphorical sink. They come to me all day long, and we're in these, we're talking in these circular loops, because they'll say, well, I touched my nose to my lips. Is that okay? Yes, that's fine. But I think I touched my bum to my mouth. Is that okay? Yeah, that's fine. Well, I said this word in my head. Am I a bad person? No, that's fine. And you're like, my gosh, what is going on here? Until you realize, I'm the sink. Like, they're coming to me and they're confessing or reassuring, getting reassurance, and I'm just turning on the sink every single time. And I'm part of the compulsion. So space can be really helpful. I think space, ERP, and ACT are beautiful together. And thankfully, we are getting more and more therapists that are getting educated in how to treat pediatric OCD and are doing those three modalities together: ERP, space, and ACT. And that's really powerful. Even ERP and space together are powerful. I think ERP has to have a place in both, in my opinion. Now, if your child is unwilling or unable to do therapy in and of themselves, space can still stand alone. That's what's beautiful about space, is it gives parents another avenue to pursue, even if their child is unable to work on their OCD alone or at all, because it will teach you how to communicate to your child what things you're doing to participate in their OCD, and how to systematically pull back your involvement to detangle you from the involvement of the compulsions. And it takes time. But there are space trained therapists who will work directly with you. And I love that, because they're getting the proper training and certification for some people to work directly with parents alone. And so that could be a beautiful thing. You can go to spacetreatment.net. That is spacetreatment.net. And they have a provider list. And they're all over the world. And so you can try to find a therapist that will work directly with you. Now, if your child is willing or able to work on their own OCD as well, then you would want to find an ERP therapist, ideally, who's working with them. And you could even get your own space therapist. Or you can get, if you find that rainbow unicorn who does all three, that's gold. Because then you're like, okay, they're going to work with me. They're going to work with my child. Sprinkle a little bit of ACT in there. We're all good to go. Unfortunately, that's not how it goes most of the time. So after the break, I'm going to talk about what can happen when you have the wrong therapist, what to look for, and some red flags. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
It's time we put help directly in our kids' hands. Introducing Crushing OCD course for kids and teens.
It was way more helpful than all the other therapy we've ever done, because we didn't really know what to do. So we weren't really doing it before. So the course helped to figure out what the exposures are and how to do them.
We're not in therapy and find it really hard to find an ERP trained therapist here. So we're currently with the public health service, but again, they don't seem to be trained in ERP. It's filled that gap that we don't have, that was needed.
This was really well timed for us to use between therapists and to help us get off to a good start with this new practice.
It was easy to use. I was able to do it from my phone or also on the computer.
There's different ages, so there were younger kids, there were teenagers, and so that was really nice too, to have a variety of ages where it wasn't just geared towards younger kids or older kids. It was a nice variety.
It's helpful for our kids to hear it from this third party as opposed to just us saying it.
I really like the offense and defense method. I love working on poking at OCD while it's sleeping. It makes it a little bit easier to do, and it kind of fun. I'm planning on using it to work on my fear of like holding or touching batteries and stuff like that.
So it was really helpful, and I think a lot of other kids would like it. I thought that I was like the only one who had worrying about the weather and stuff. And then there was somebody else on there who worried about the same thing, which was really helpful.
Seems less scary to work on stuff now that I've watched this class, and I'm more interested to work on it.
I like trying to do more exposures still, and before I wasn't, I just didn't want to do them.
I've worked on some of my bigger compulsions and been successful.
I realized that it was helpful to do like the exposures. Before it was like really, really hard. It's still hard, but it's helpful to know that I need to do them.
Before there would be a lot of battles about it. So it is definitely less loggerheads.
Really, really good course and super helpful.
Definitely would recommend this. It's really easy to follow. It's nice bite-sized videos. I really like the worksheets that go along with it, and I think it's really helpful.
To learn more about this course and register your child or teen, go to atparentingsurvivalschool.com.
Welcome back. In the first part of the podcast, we talked about the evidence-based approaches for pediatric OCD, and that's ERP, SPACE, and ACT. There are some other therapies that are currently not evidence-based. There's not research that's showing the efficacy of treatment for OCD. And some of those include EMDR, biofeedback, neurofeedback. I would even say ICBT, inference-based cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a new type of therapy that's being used for OCD. That kind of has split the OCD community into two halves, where people are like, yay, ICBT, and other people are, no, ICBT, no. But there is no research to show that the efficacy is there for pediatric OCD. And that is, at this point in the recording of this podcast, it may change, but there is no research to support that. And we have other modalities that there is plenty of research to support that. And so currently, when you look at OCD research from the International OCD Foundation and other foundations that are putting a lot of money into research, we can say with certainty that ERP, SPACE, and ACT are solid. So let's stick with the solid ones, for now. Who knows? I mean, we can have an open mind. Welcome other approaches, but when we're talking about our kids and their long-term care, we want to make sure that we're doing things that have some efficacy behind them. So what happens when you get the wrong therapist who thinks they can treat OCD and they're using modalities that are not research-backed? Well, the first thing that can happen is they can grow OCD. And that's the worst thing that we want. We don't want our kids to get more intrusive thoughts. And this can happen in a lot of different ways. If you rationalize OCD and you say, your hands are clean. You've washed them 40 times. Why do you have to wash them 41 times? You can clearly look and see that your hands are clean. That doesn't matter to someone with OCD because their brain is stuck. And they're stuck in the doing of hand washing. And they know it's irrational most of the time, and it doesn't matter. And so when you try to problem solve and rationalize, and I've had a lot of families come and see me or join the AT parenting community globally and say to me, Natasha, the therapist recommended that we, have him wear gloves, or that we touch things for him, or we wash things down so he knows they are clean, or we reassure him that nobody else has touched this. That is really scary. And that is what a therapist would do if they don't understand OCD. Not all of us who have no training in OCD would do that, but some do, because I've heard it firsthand. And that is teaching you how to be part of the compulsion, telling you wipe things down, have them wear gloves, open doors for them, tell them that they're not a bad person, list all the reasons. You are actively putting yourself in the line of fire with OCD, joining OCD and doing compulsions. And so you can have entire therapy sessions that are literally one huge compulsion session. The therapist is part of the loop, reassuring that person over and over again why their intrusive thoughts are not true, debating with them, and really basically doing one big compulsion the whole time, and you're paying for it. So not only is it growing OCD, but it's hurting your bank account and it's hurting your child. Bad, 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 right? All bad. Some other areas that can get concerning is they may not understand it and they might blame the parent. And so they might worry about family dynamics. They might worry about trauma that's not there. They might worry about finding the reason why your child feels like you're emotionally contaminated, right? And they wouldn't even know that word. But there are times, and OCD wears so many different disguises that it can show up in so many different ways that unless you really understand OCD, you won't catch all these things. And there are times where people become emotionally contaminated. And so family member, I'm just going to give you an example. I mean, it could be a zillion different things, but it's just an example. You can have a family member who is contaminated for whatever reason. And it could be for anything. You could have a child in the house who picked their nose, and your other child who has OCD saw them pick their nose at one point, and now that person is completely ground zero for contamination. They may not even remember that it's because they saw that person pick their nose. So let's say it's a dad who picks their nose. I'm just using this as an example. And that person has become ground zero for contamination. So anything that dad touches, they can't touch. Anything that dad does, they can't be around. Dad comes into a room, they have to go to another room. Dad is emotionally contaminated. Dad touches something, now that thing's contaminated, and it spreads through dad. Let's say you get a therapist who doesn't understand OCD, who thinks they do. Because a lot of good therapists will say, I don't treat OCD, let me refer you out. Yay to you guys who do that, because it's good to know what you do and what you don't do. I refer out to people that have other issues. I don't do eating disorders. I don't do anything outside of anxiety or OCD. So you come to me for ADHD or trauma, I'm referring you out. I'm an anxiety and OCD therapist. Now I don't have a private practice at all, but that's where I was at before I closed my practice. But let's say I have a therapist who thinks that they can handle this and doesn't have the expertise. They might say, I wonder what dad did to cause that. They're having a relationship issue because, she leaves the room when dad walks in. What happened there? And it's not to say that we don't want to work, notice the big picture around things, but more often than not, it can get mislabeled as something that it isn't. And then we're working on family dynamics and relationships when truly it's just dad picked his nose one time and the child's OCD got latched onto that. There's no other significance other than the fact that dad picked his nose one time. And I'm just using that as a really simplistic example. But that's a slippery slope if a therapist who doesn't understand how OCD can latch on to even the most ridiculous things gives it more meaning, sees abuse or it could go really sideways. The other areas that can go sideways really fast are harm OCD. So when you have intrusive thoughts around harm, you might worry that you might harm yourself. You might worry that you might do something to take your life, even though that's not what you want. Or you might be worried that you might harm someone else. So you might be like, hide the knives. I don't trust myself. I'm not sure if I'll hurt myself, or I might hurt you, or I might stab you. And when people start to feel safe enough because they're seeing a therapist to divulge those intrusive thoughts of, I think I might hurt myself. If you have a therapist who does not understand OCD or can't rule in or rule out true self-harm from intrusive thoughts about self-harm or harm to others, you're in another slippery slope, because now you might be, referring inpatient because you think I'm at a risk for self-harm, or you might think I'm at a risk for other people. There's a duty to warn. You might think you have to call other people and warn them that I have the intention to harm them. You can see where that can go real sideways really fast. As a therapist, I might say, you need to hide all the knives or hide all the pills because your child's telling me that they're really afraid of themselves and they might take all those pills or they might stab themselves. And if they don't have the expertise to say this child has a lot of OCD red flags, because you always have to decipher, what is self-harm versus intrusive thoughts about that. So even an OCD therapist will be doing an assessment to rule out, is this OCD or is this a true self-harm concern or harm to other concern? And an OCD therapist will quickly be able to see the difference. A therapist who's not specializing in OCD will not even know that they need to know the difference. They'll think that what they see is what they get. And that is really dangerous. I've seen a lot of kids in my time as being a therapist who were referred to inpatient treatment for suicidal ideation when it was OCD. And the sad thing is, when you tell a parent to hide the knives or hide the pills, and it's not true suicidal ideation, it's OCD, or you, worse, commit them, and they are in an inpatient facility for suicidal ideation, that is like OCD's biggest dream. It's like you're completely 100% validating the OCD. You're telling that person by your actions that those thoughts are not intrusive thoughts. Those are valid thoughts, and that we're taking valid steps to keep them safe, which blows up their OCD and makes the situation 10 times worse. So that's another example. Now, hopefully none of you are dealing with that, but a lot of parents do. And they can go years and years, sometimes decades, getting the wrong kind of therapy, addressing the wrong issue, because it's actually OCD in disguise. OCD can also be misdiagnosed as ADHD because they're doing all these mental compulsions. They're making lists in their head, or they're canceling out a negative thought with a positive thought, or they're compulsively praying every time they have an OCD thought, or they're counting evens or odds or all sorts of mental compulsions, and they're not focusing. And so on the surface, it looks like they can't attend, they can't focus, they can't do multiple step directions. And it's not necessarily because they have ADHD, it's because they are being bombarded with intrusive thoughts or mental compulsions, or both. Now, ADHD is also another comorbid condition, so they do often hang out together, but a skilled OCD therapist will be able to say what is OCD versus what is ADHD. And that's important because then we have all these kids getting on ADHD medications, and they truly don't have ADHD, and stimulants often make OCD worse. So you can see where this is all really, really bad. If they have both, there are some medications that won't make OCD worse, but they aren't the go-to medications that are initially prescribed. And so having a clinician or a psychiatrist be aware that there's OCD and ADHD is really important so that we get the right kind of medications for both disorders. It can happen in lots of other disorders as well, but you can see where an OCD therapist is more likely to be able to see what is OCD versus other disorders versus someone who doesn't know what OCD looks like, but can kind of get other disorders. That could be a problem. So what do you look for? When you're looking for an OCD therapist, and there are getting more and more people are getting educated. I mean, I've been doing this for 2 decades, and I feel like we are in such a better spot now than we were 20 years ago, for sure. We have a long way to go, but it's not nearly as bad as it was, and we just want to keep on moving forward. So it's not as impossible as it used to be to find a pediatric OCD therapist, but also there are more and more therapists that think they can handle OCD and they can't. So that is scary. And I think it's important for therapists to realize that OCD is coming from a different part of the brain, and that it's not anxiety. It's not a manifestation of anxiety. I've heard the craziest stuff from people in my AG parenting community, like a therapist saying, if they work on the anxiety, the OCD will go away because the OCD is just a manifestation of the need to control. That is inaccurate. OCD is an issue with the circuitry in the basal ganglia, and things are getting stuck in the doing. And so they're getting these intrusive thoughts and they're getting these compulsions to do. It's not a manifestation of anxiety. It's anxiety producing for sure, but it's not a manifestation of anxiety. And that's why they put them in 2 different categories diagnostically. So you're looking for somebody who brings up ERP. If you're talking to a therapist and they don't know what ERP is, and they're saying they treat OCD, that's a huge, huge red flag. Because anyone who truly has had training in treating OCD, in evidence-based approaches for OCD, will know what ERP is. So if you're talking to a therapist and you're saying, do you treat OCD? And they say yes. And you say, do you do ERP? And they said, what's ERP? And you say a type of cognitive behavioral therapy. And they say, oh, CBT, I do CBT. I've got red flags now. You can look for provider in the International OCD Foundation. IOCDF does have a provider directory at iocdf.org/find-help. But here's a caveat to that. Anybody can join that directory. Anybody can put their name on there. All they have to do is become a member, and now they can be part of that directory. The fact that they know that the IOCDF exists, to me, is a good sign. And so it's a better list than if I was to go to like Psychology Today and just look up any random person in my neighborhood. The odds of me finding an OCD therapist are less, even though they might be on Psychology Today. Nothing wrong with Psychology Today, but I'm not going to a specialized directory. And so I think going to the IOCDF directory is just stacking, what is this saying? The odds in your favor, something like that. But they don't vet them. So just be warned, even though their name is on the IOCDF directory, that doesn't mean that they've been vetted. Then you have to do your own vetting and you have to look at their experience. Do they mention ERP? How much, what percentage of their clientele have OCD? Have they been to the BTTI? So the BTTI, they have a pediatric BTTI and they have a general BTTI in the IOCDF. And that's the advanced training on how to treat OCD. So if they've been to the BTTI, which in the provider directory for the International OCD Foundation, they do list if somebody has been to that training. Now, if they haven't been to that training, it doesn't mean that they're a bad therapist. It's really hard to get into the BTTI. They don't do enough of them. And I feel like they should do virtual ones where, thousands of people can join. But the cool thing about the BTTI is that they will partner you with one of the presenters, like one of the researchers or one of the therapists that was teaching. And then you'll have consultations for a few months after that to follow up and be there to support you as you utilize those tools. So that's actually very cool. So I get that makes it a little bit harder as far as how many people they can get through that program at one time. But that is something to look for as well. And I would ask them questions of like, how do you treat OCD? How do you treat OCD differently than you treat other issues in your practice? And if they say things like, I do CBT and I do mindfulness and a little bit of DBT, I'm not hearing what I'm looking for. I want to hear specifically that they're doing ERP. And even if they say I do a little space and DBT, I'm still listening for the ERP. To me, a pediatric OCD therapist will mention ERP. Even if they say I'm an ACT therapist, if you said, do you do ERP? They will know what you're talking about. And they might say, I do maybe value-based exposures. That's great. They know the language. They know the evidence-based approaches. So you want to look for those things. You really want to be very specific in what you're asking for. And you might even ask them, like, what do your sessions look like? Are they going to be doing exposures in session eventually? Are they going to be doing homework? Are they going to be having them do stuff outside of the office? Because it takes a little while to educate, to do some psychoeducation on what OCD is, to develop rapport. But down the road, when you get into the meat of therapy, there should be a lot of work done outside of the office. And that's important. So I want to end with some red flags to look for. If it's just talk therapy, that's a red flag. Because talk therapy does not get rid of OCD. You can talk until you're blue in the face and OCD will laugh and say, thank you for the session. That was delicious and you've grown me bigger. Talk therapy is not an evidence-based approach. So anything that's just, we're going to talk about your issues. You're going to vent, get it out, explore it. Let's talk about the origin of it. That's not going to help OCD. So that'd be a concern. If they're problem solving, like in a rational way, well, he's worried that his pencils from school are going to contaminate his house. So I have this great idea. Why don't you take all the pencils and put them in the laundry room before he comes into the house, and then he can take off all of his clothes and he can put everything that came from school in that room and he can put on his home clothes. Yikes. That's not good. You're just basically spoon feeding another compulsion. So if they're problem solving in a rational way, how to circumvent OCD issues, do not walk, please run to another therapist. I would rather, and I have 3 kids with anxiety and OCD, 2 with OCD, all 3 with anxiety. And I would rather have my kids not have any therapy at all than have a really bad therapist that is going to do more harm than good. And in fact, my kids have been in lots of therapy, in lots of different therapists. And one said that they specialized in OCD and they did actually have all the qualifications and they were horrific. And they kept saying things to my son that were making his OCD worse. And I was undoing what she was saying when I would be driving home. And eventually I was like, even though she has all the great credentials, she was not well seasoned and she didn't know what she was doing. And so eventually I got them into other therapists that didn't have any specialty in OCD, but I would go in there and I'd say, I don't want you to deal with the OCD, because I could not find an OCD therapist, ironically, that I didn't have like a dual relationship with, someone who knew me outside of just treating my child. But those therapists stayed in their lane, and then they didn't touch the OCD, because I'd say, I don't want you dealing with this OCD issue. I just want you to come and talk about his dad dying, right? My kids lost their dad. They needed a therapist, but I didn't want them touching the OCD because I knew they didn't have the skills. They didn't know what they were doing, and they didn't want to do it either. They knew they didn't have the skills either, and I appreciated that. So we want to make sure that they're getting the right kind of help. Another red flag would be, and now this one's a tricky one, but we'll talk about it. They won't communicate with the family. Now this one's hard because what I'm noticing in my AT parenting community, which is an online global community where I provide in-depth support. We open the doors a few times a year. You can check it out at atparentingcommunity.com. We're a fantastic group of people. We normally have a little bit over 1,000, maybe like sometimes 1,200, 1,300 members all over the world. United States, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, India. We've got people from all over the world. But it is different, I notice, in different countries. That's why there's a caveat to this. Some really good OCD therapists still do not involve the family, and that is unfortunate. But in a perfect world, you want the therapist to communicate with you on some level. What should you be doing at home? What is going on in the office? What are they working on? And at the very least, you just want to know that they're doing ERP, exposure response prevention, or working up towards that. You don't want to hear that they're problem solving and just talking about their day or venting about their best friend. And so at the very, very least, you should have at least an understanding of what are the therapy goals, what are you working on, and what therapy modality are you using. Now, in a perfect world, they're involving you on some level. They're letting you know what you should be doing at home and giving you resources at home and letting you know what your child's homework is. Now my kids are thankfully they're both seeing therapists who are well-skilled and well-trained in this world of anxiety and OCD. And they do let me know. They'll message me and they'll be like, this is her homework for the week. This is what she's working on. And I appreciate that, because even if I'm not babysitting it and I'm not telling her, you need to be doing your homework, I know at least mentally, this is what she's supposed to be working on. And that doesn't happen all the time. And so it doesn't mean that you have a bad OCD therapist. It just means that you might have to advocate a little bit, because I do notice that in Australia and Canada in particular, the therapists there seem to have more of a slant of, I'm just working with this child and there's confidentiality and I'm not going to keep you in the loop. And there's different laws in different countries and different states that kind of complicate the issue. And so if you know they're doing ERP and your child seems okay with what's going on, you may not be privy to what's happening. And even though I think that's horrible and that's not the way to go and it's not the way I do therapy, I was talking to some therapists in Australia and they said they only get a certain amount of sessions. And if they were to take those sessions and work sometimes with the parent, the child wouldn't be getting all of those sessions. And so they have to make hard decisions of where to focus their treatment. And I get that. And that's unfortunate. And I think that that's kind of the issue sometimes with government-funded therapy, is they kind of dictate how many sessions you get and who gets the sessions. And so ironically, sometimes it's easier when you're paying out of pocket, although some of us can't even get there because it's way too expensive. And most, I don't know if I should say that, but I think it's true. Most OCD therapists do not take insurance. And I think that's really, really unfortunate. But because there is such a lack of trained pediatric OCD therapists know that they don't have to take insurance. And insurance companies are a nightmare. They're really hard to work with. They're hard to negotiate rates with. They don't always see the efficacy of certain things. And so you're always having to fight them, or they lost your claim. So I get it as a therapist why a lot of OCD therapists do not take insurance. But that is really unfortunate, because what winds up happening is parents are like, you know what, I need to find someone in network. And more often than not, they're going to find the therapist who says they know how to treat OCD and doesn't, because they're taking insurance. And that's messed up. That is messed up. And I wish the world was different in that way. I wish there were so many OCD therapists that so many of them took insurance, because they were not a unicorn. But because right now they're still a unicorn, and maybe that will change over time, it has to change, right? But right now, because they know they're a unicorn, they don't have to work with insurance companies. They can choose and they can say, I'm not going to take insurance. And people will still fill up their time slots because people are desperate to find that therapist. So in Canada and Australia, in the UK, where you can get government funded treatment, you might be on a waiting list for 6 months, 12 months, but you don't have to pay for it and go broke. However, the odds of you actually getting an OCD therapist are slim to none. So it's like lose everywhere. So that's unfortunate. And that is a big part of why I am so passionate as a mom to 3 kids with anxiety and OCD, and as a therapist to make things accessible to parents, to give you the tools and information directly to say, if you can't find an OCD therapist, then maybe it's just better to not have therapy. If you're going to take them to someone who's going to do more harm than good, educate yourself and get on the wait list, right? I mean, find that unicorn, get on their wait list, and then don't wait while you're on the wait list. Educate yourself and start working with your child, because time is ticking and proactive approaches are key in keeping OCD at bay. So do what you can. Take a course. That's actually why I started everything I do, is because I felt like parents were missing evidence-based approaches, and they were sitting on wait lists as their kids were getting worse and worse and worse. And that's ridiculous. So I do have courses at atparentingsurvivalschool.com, atparentingsurvivalschool.com. I felt like I said that really fast. And one is called How to Teach Kids to Crush OCD. One is called How to Teach Kids to Crush Anxiety. They're 2 very different courses, because how you crush anxiety is the opposite of how you're going to crush OCD. And so I'll often tell people, if you're dealing with both, just take my How to Teach Kids to Crush OCD course first, because everything you learn in the anxiety course, I wouldn't want you doing with OCD. So you have to get really good at what is anxiety and what is OCD, and how am I going to interact with this issue versus this issue, because they're going to be different. 2 of my kids have anxiety and OCD, and how I deal with their anxiety is different than how I deal with their OCD. And so that is important. And that also is why I wrote my workbook, Crushing OCD Workbook for Kids, because I wanted to give parents and even therapists and I've had some therapists actually reach out to me and say, I am in a really small community, and I am one of the only mental health providers in like a 500-mile radius in this really tiny, tiny, small town. And people come to me, and there are no alternatives. And so I have used your resources as a guide to help do therapy with these kids who have OCD issues, because it's me or nothing. And those are great therapists because they recognize there's a lack of resources. They recognize that they're the only go-to person, and that they recognize that they don't have all the knowledge to treat these kids. And so they're looking for resources. And I had a couple of therapists reach out to me recently and say that story, that they're from a small town, and that my OCD workbook is helping them fill in the gap, because now they at least have a tool that can walk them through how to help the child, and they know it's evidence-based. And so that makes me feel really good, because I didn't really think about that when I made that workbook. I was really thinking about the desperate parent who learned enough to realize what was bad therapy, but then didn't have an alternative. And now they're like, okay, I have some resources, some affordable resources, because a workbook is definitely a lot cheaper than a course. And so some affordable resources at their fingertips to at least get them started, to get you started, to get your child started, so that they're not getting worse and worse while getting older on a wait list. So I hope that you found this helpful. I hope that you find all my podcast episodes helpful. My goal is that everybody will know what OCD is, and everybody will know what an OCD therapist looks like. And therapists will know that they don't have the skill to treat every disorder, and that if they want to treat OCD, they need to get the education and training to do that. And they have to know when they do not have the education and training. And sometimes people need to get the training just to refer out to say, okay, I recognize that this is OCD, and I recognize that I don't treat OCD. And what a beautiful world that will be. And until then, I'm going to just get my little mic soapbox and spread the knowledge directly to parents so that they can make educated and smart decisions around their treatment for their kids. So I hope that you're finding my podcast helpful. Don't forget to hit a star on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcast. If you have a few extra seconds and you want to write a review, you know I greatly appreciate that. I hope that you find the sparkle in everything you do. And I thank you for sitting here and getting educated, because we need that in the world. And I'll talk to you again next Tuesday. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the AT Parenting Survival Podcast. To get additional support raising a child with anxiety or OCD, visit Natasha's online school of on-demand classes at atparentingsurvivalschool.com.